Captain Ziktar adjusted his position in the command chair of the starship Boundless Horizon, his six-fingered hands moving across the control interface with practiced precision. The bridge hummed with the quiet efficiency of a Galactic Alliance vessel on a diplomatic mission. Around him, his crew representing 5 different star systems worked in perfect harmony, their communication flowing through a combination of telepathic links and vocal exchanges in the universal trade language. Status report, First Officer Pax. Ziktar commanded his voice, carrying the authoritative tone that had earned him command of one of the Alliance's most prestigious vessels. Pax, whose crystalline skin refracted the bridge's soft lighting in prismatic patterns, looked up from his station. All systems optimal, Captain. We're maintaining course for the rendezvous point with the human delegation. Estimated arrival in 47 standard time units. Ziktar nodded, though a subtle tension rippled through his thoughts. This was his first direct interaction with the species known as humans. Those bipedal creatures from the third planet of the Sol system. The Galactic Alliance had been in preliminary communication with them for several rotations now, but face-to-face meetings were still rare enough to cause significant interest throughout Alliance space. What do we know about their representative? Ziktar asked, turning to his xenobiology officer, Lieutenant Keth. Keth, whose serpentine form was coiled around a specialized workstation, consulted his data displays. Ambassador Nora Castillo, Captain. According to our files, she's been designated as the primary diplomatic contact for the Sol System's governing body. Age 34 standard years, which appears to be middle-aged for their species. She has extensive experience in interspecies relations within her own system. Curious, Ziktar mused. They're sending someone relatively young by our standards. Their lifespans are significantly shorter than most Alliance species, Pax observed. What seems young to us may represent substantial experience for them. The next several hours passed without incident as the Boundless Horizon made its approach to the designated meeting coordinates. When the human vessel appeared on their sensors, a sleek, angular ship that seemed almost primitive compared to Alliance technology, Ziktar felt an unexpected flutter of anticipation. Incoming transmission from the human vessel, announced communications specialist Vora, her insectoid features clicking as she spoke. They are requesting permission to dock. Grant their request, Ziktar ordered. Have the diplomatic suite prepared for our guests. As the docking procedures commenced, Ziktar found himself reviewing everything he knew about humans. They were carbon-based, like many Alliance species, but their social structures were remarkably complex. Unlike the hive minds of the Zephyrians or the collective consciousness of the Aldorians, humans operated as individuals with their own thoughts and motivations. Most intriguingly, they were said to experience something called emotions, a concept that most Alliance species found difficult to understand. The docking bay pressurized with a soft hiss, and Ziktar, accompanied by Pax and 2 other senior officers, made his way to greet their guests. The airlock cycled open, and for the first time in his long career, Captain Ziktar found himself face-to-face with a human being. Ambassador Nora Castillo was smaller than he had expected, standing barely 2/3 his height. Her skin was a warm brown tone, unlike the pale descriptions in their files, and her hair was dark and pulled back in what his briefing materials had termed a professional style. Her clothing was simple but elegant, a dark blue garment that covered most of her body with subtle decorative elements that spoke of both function and aesthetics. Captain Ziktar, she said, extending one of her arms in what he recognized as the human greeting gesture called a handshake. Her voice was surprisingly melodious, with subtle variations in tone that he suspected conveyed meaning beyond the mere words. I'm Ambassador Nora Castillo. It's an honor to meet you. Ziktar carefully took her much smaller hand in his own, noting the warmth of her skin and the firmness of her grip. The honor is mine, Ambassador. Welcome aboard the Boundless Horizon. I trust your journey was pleasant. Quite smooth, thank you. She gestured to the 2 humans behind her, one male, one female, both carrying small cases that presumably contained diplomatic materials. May I introduce my aide, Marcus Chen, and our cultural attaché, Sarah Williams. Ziktar acknowledged the introductions and led the human delegation to the ship's main diplomatic suite, a large, circular room designed to accommodate various species' needs. The lighting could be adjusted for different visual spectra, the atmosphere modified for different respiratory requirements, and the seating arrangements adapted for a wide variety of physiologies. Please make yourselves comfortable, Ziktar offered, gesturing to chairs that had been specially configured for human anatomy. Can we offer you refreshments? Our replicators have been programmed with several human-compatible beverages. That's very thoughtful, Ambassador Castillo replied, settling into one of the chairs. Perhaps some water if you have it. As his steward, a graceful, elongated being from Centauri Prime served the humans, Ziktar noticed something odd about Ambassador Castillo's behavior. She seemed to be looking around the room with more than casual interest, and there was something about her facial expressions that didn't quite align with what he understood of human communication. Ambassador, Ziktar began, my understanding is that you wish to discuss the possibility of expanding trade relationships between our civilizations. Yes, Captain. The human government is very interested in establishing formal trade agreements with the Alliance. She paused, her gaze seeming to focus on something beyond the immediate conversation. We believe we have much to offer your member species and much to learn from them. As she spoke, Ziktar noticed a subtle change in her demeanor. Her voice, which had been steady and professional, began to waver slightly. Her breathing seemed to quicken, and she looked down at her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap. Ambassador, Pax inquired with his characteristic directness, are you experiencing some form of physical distress? Should we adjust the environmental controls? No, I'm fine, she replied quickly, but her voice caught on the words. She looked up at them, and Ziktar was startled to see clear fluid forming in her eyes. As he watched in fascination and growing alarm, the fluid gathered and began to overflow, creating small streams down her face. The effect was immediate and profound. Every Alliance officer in the room tensed their hands, moving instinctively toward their sidearms. Lieutenant Keth's serpentine form coiled tighter around his position, while communications specialist Vora's antenna flattened against her head in a clear sign of distress. Ambassador, Ziktar exclaimed, rising from his seat. What is happening? Are you under attack? Is this some kind of biological weapon? To his complete bewilderment, Ambassador Castillo began to make strange sound, a series of hiccuping, gasping noises that seemed to accompany the fluid emission from her eyes. Her escort, Marcus and Sarah, showed no signs of alarm. In fact, Sarah moved closer to Ambassador Castillo and placed a hand on her shoulder in what appeared to be a supportive gesture. It's all right, Sarah said to the room at large, her voice calm and reassuring. Ambassador Castillo is crying. It's a normal human response to certain emotional stimuli. Crying. Pax repeated the unfamiliar word, his crystalline features reflecting confusion. Is this some form of distress signal? Should we contact our medical bay? No. Ambassador Castillo managed to say between what Ziktar would later learn were called sobs. I'm sorry, this is quite normal for humans. I'm experiencing what we call grief. Grief. Ziktar felt as though he was navigating completely uncharted space. I'm not familiar with this concept. Ambassador Castillo wiped at her eyes with a small piece of fabric. A handkerchief, Sarah explained, and took several deep breaths. Captain, I need to apologize for this display. I received news just before our meeting that my father passed away. In human terms, that means he died, ceased to exist. When humans lose someone important to us, we often experience strong emotional responses, including the physical manifestation you're witnessing, tears. The silence that followed was profound. Ziktar found himself completely at a loss. In all his years of diplomatic service, representing the Galactic Alliance, in countless negotiations and first contact scenarios, he had never encountered anything like this. the Alliance species he knew dealt with death in logical, practical ways. When a Vulcarian's life cycle ended, their community celebrated the completion of their existence. When an Andromedean entered their final phase, they uploaded their consciousness to the collective memory banks. But this emotional display was entirely foreign. "You're leaking fluid because someone has died," Lieutenant Keth asked slowly, as if trying to process completely alien information. "It's more complex than that," Marcus explained, his voice patient, but tinged with what Ziktar was beginning to recognize as emotional undertones. "Humans form emotional bonds with each other. When someone we love dies, we experience psychological and physical responses. Crying is one way we process grief." Pax's crystalline form shifted slightly, reflecting different colors, a sign of deep contemplation in his species. "And this is normal?" "This physical leakage accompanied by respiratory irregularities." "Completely normal," Sarah confirmed, "though the intensity varies from person to person and situation to situation." Ziktar felt a strange sensation that he would later realize was curiosity mixed with unease. "Ambassador, do you require time to recover from this condition? We can postpone our discussions." "No, Captain." Ambassador Castillo said, her voice stronger now, though her eyes still showed the effects of the tears. "I appreciate your concern, but humans are capable of functioning normally while experiencing emotions. In fact, I would argue that emotions are part of what make us function at all." Over the following days, as the diplomatic meetings continued, Ziktar found himself observing the humans with a fascination that bordered on obsession. Ambassador Castillo, he learned, could transition from the tear-producing state she called sadness to something she termed joy with remarkable fluidity. When she laughed, another bewildering human behavior involving rhythmic exhalations and a display of teeth that might have seemed threatening in other species, her whole posture changed. When she became angry over a particularly complex trade regulation, her face reddened and her voice took on a sharper tone. But it was not just Ambassador Castillo. Marcus displayed what he called nervousness when presenting technical specifications evidenced by rapid speech and fidgeting movements. Sarah showed excitement when discussing cultural exchange programs, speaking faster and using more animated gestures. Most disturbing to Ziktar was how contagious these emotions seemed to be. After several days in the human's company, he noticed that his own crew was behaving differently. Pax, normally a model of logical efficiency, had begun asking questions about human poetry and art. Lieutenant Keth had requested access to human music files. Even Vora had been observed attempting to replicate human facial expressions. It was on the fourth day of the delegation's visit that Ziktar received an encrypted message from Alliance Central Command. He retreated to his private quarters to decode it, and what he read chilled him to his very core. "Captain Ziktar," the message began, "our xenopsychology analysts have been reviewing your reports on human emotional behavior. We are transmitting this at the highest priority and classification. Based on our research into human history and behavioral patterns, we have concluded that their emotional capabilities represent a significant strategic advantage in both diplomatic and military contexts. Evidence suggests that humans can weaponize these emotions, using them to manipulate the responses of other species. You are ordered to maintain strict security protocols and gather as much intelligence as possible about human emotional capabilities. Do not let them know that we consider this a potential threat. End transmission." Ziktar read the message 3 times before the full implications settled in. For days he had been witnessing what he thought was simply an interesting biological quirk. But Alliance Command was telling him he was observing a potential weapon. He thought of Ambassador Castillo's tears, her laughter, the way she had made even his most disciplined officers begin to question their own emotional limitations. That evening, as the Boundless Horizon's main lights dimmed to simulate a rest period, Ziktar found himself walking the corridors of his ship trying to process what he had learned. He paused outside the guest quarters and heard something unexpected: music. Specifically, human music with complex harmonies and emotional undertones that seemed to resonate in ways that no Alliance music ever had. He activated the door chime and Ambassador Castillo answered, looking relaxed in what appeared to be human leisure clothing. "Captain," she said, smiling, another human expression that involved a precise arrangement of facial muscles. "Is everything all right? May I come in? I find myself with questions about your species that our formal meetings haven't addressed." "Of course." She stepped aside and he entered to find Marcus and Sarah engaged in what they called conversation with several of his off-duty crew members. He recognized communications specialist Vora and two of his engineering officers, all listening intently as Marcus explained something about human emotional responses to music. "Captain Ziktar?" Sarah noticed him first. "We were just discussing the relationship between music and emotion in human culture. Your crew has been asking fascinating questions." Ziktar nodded politely and gestured to Ambassador Castillo. "Might I speak with you privately for a moment?" They moved to a quiet corner of the quarters, and Ziktar found himself struggling with how to begin. "Ambassador, I've been observing your species for several days now, and I must admit I find your emotional capabilities both fascinating and concerning." Concerning? Her eyebrows, those small lines of hair above her eyes, moved upward in what he had learned was an expression of surprise or curiosity. "Your tears, your laughter. The way you can influence the behavior of my crew through what you call emotional expression, are these abilities used strategically by your people?" Ambassador Castillo was quiet for a long moment, and Ziktar noticed that her facial expression went through several changes: surprise, thoughtfulness, and something he couldn't identify. "Captain, are you asking if we weaponize our emotions?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. Yes, I suppose I am." She smiled again, but this time the expression seemed different, sadder perhaps, or more complex. "The answer is both yes and no, Captain. Humans don't generally use emotions as weapons in the way you might think of weapons, but emotions are part of everything we do. They influence our decisions, our relationships, our art, our politics. They can be used to build bridges or to tear them down. They can inspire incredible acts of courage and sacrifice, or terrible acts of destruction." Ziktar felt that unfamiliar sensation again, the one he was beginning to think might be what humans called unease. "So, you could use your emotional capabilities to manipulate other species." "We could," she admitted. "But asking if humans weaponize emotions is like asking if humans weaponize communication or intelligence. It's not about the tool, it's about the intention behind its use." Before Ziktar could respond, an urgent chime sounded throughout the ship, the signal for all hands to report to stations. He activated his communication device and heard Pax's voice tight with tension. "Captain, we have 3 hegemony warships approaching fast. They're not responding to hails, and their weapon systems are charging." The hegemony. Ziktar's entire body went rigid. The hegemony was a militaristic alliance of species that had broken away from the Galactic Alliance years ago, believing that the Alliance's peaceful cooperative approach was weak and inefficient. They had been expanding aggressively through several star systems, conquering rather than negotiating. "I have to go." Ziktar told Ambassador Castillo, "Please remain in your quarters for your safety." "Captain?" she called after him as he moved toward the door. "Our ship has defensive capabilities. We can help." "This is an Alliance vessel," he called back. "We'll handle it according to Alliance protocols." But as he rushed to the bridge, Ziktar's mind was racing. The Boundless Horizon was a diplomatic vessel, not a warship. They had defensive systems, but against 3 hegemony battlecruisers, their chances were minimal. Alliance protocol would be to attempt communication, then retreat if communication failed. But they were too far from Alliance space to call for backup, and their guests made retreat complicated. The bridge was in controlled chaos when he arrived. Pax was coordinating defensive measures, while Lieutenant Keth monitored the approaching vessels. Status report, Ziktar ordered, settling into his command chair. 3 hegemony warships, Captain. Heavy cruiser class. They've ignored all our attempts at communication and are approaching in attack formation. Ziktar studied the tactical display. The hegemony ships had them significantly outgunned. Time to weapons range. 6 minutes, Captain. Signal the human vessel. Tell them to retreat to a safe distance. Captain, came Ambassador Castillo's voice over the communications system. We're not leaving. Ambassador, this is not a request. Move your vessel away from the combat zone immediately. With respect, Captain, we're not abandoning you. Before Ziktar could respond, the lead hegemony vessel opened communication. A face appeared on the main screen. The cruel features of a hegemony commander, his species unknown to Ziktar, but clearly predatory in nature. Alliance vessel. The commander growled, you will surrender immediately. Prepare to be boarded. Ziktar stood drawing on all his diplomatic training. This is Captain Ziktar of the Galactic Alliance vessel Boundless Horizon. We are on a peaceful diplomatic mission. Under interstellar law, you have no authority to detain us. The hegemony commander's face twisted into what might have been a smile among his species. Interstellar law is what we say it is in this sector, Alliance fool. You have 30 seconds to drop your shields and prepare for boarding. The communication ended. Ziktar looked around his bridge at the faces of his crew, each representing a different species, each reflecting their own interpretation of fear and determination. Captain, came Ambassador Castillo's voice again. We have a proposal. Ambassador, this is not the time. Captain, trust me. Let us help. Something in her voice made him pause. It wasn't just the words, it was the emotion behind them. Confidence, determination, and something else he couldn't identify. Very well, Ambassador, what do you propose? We would like to establish a communication link between our ship and yours, and we would like your permission to open a channel to the hegemony vessels. Pax looked at Ziktar with what was clearly confusion in his crystalline features. Captain, Alliance Protocol. Override Protocol, Ziktar heard himself saying. He wasn't sure why, but something about Ambassador Castillo's emotional undertones made him want to trust her. Do it. Within moments, the communication link was established. Ambassador Castillo appeared on the screen, but she was no longer in her diplomatic attire. She wore what appeared to be a military uniform, and her bearing had changed completely. Captain Ziktar, she said, what you're about to see is an example of what my species calls the weaponization of emotion. But we prefer to think of it as emotional warfare, using feelings, empathy, and psychological understanding as tools of strategy. On the screen, Ambassador Castillo seemed to take a deep breath. When she opened the channel to the hegemony vessels, her entire demeanor had changed again. Gone was the diplomatic ambassador or the military officer. In their place was something that made even Ziktar's hardened bridge crew step back slightly. Her eyes, those same eyes that had leaked tears over her father's death, now held a coldness that seemed to pierce space itself. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics and undertones that seemed to bypass rational thought entirely. Hegemony vessels, she began, and her voice seemed to echo in ways that defied the physics of spaceship communication systems. I am speaking on behalf of the human species. We are the civilization you have heard whispers about, the one that ends wars not through superior firepower, but through superior understanding of fear. Ziktar watched the tactical displays as the hegemony ships approach subtly slowed. You have heard stories about us. Ambassador Castillo continued, her voice taking on qualities that seemed to bypass the audio system entirely and speak directly to the nervous systems of everyone listening. How we survived countless wars on our own planet, how we learned to turn an enemy's strength against them, how we discovered that the mind is a battlefield and emotions are weapons, more precise than any energy beam. One of the hegemony ships had stopped advancing entirely. What you see before you isn't just a diplomatic vessel and its escort, she said. and now her voice carried undertones of something that made Ziktar's own species' fight or flight responses activate. It's an early warning system, a sensor probe. We've been watching your expansion, studying your tactics, learning your psychological profiles. The lead hegemony vessel had stopped as well, though its weapons remained charged. Do you know what human intelligence has learned about your species? Ambassador Castillo asked, and somehow her voice seemed to be coming from inside Ziktar's head as much as from the speakers. We know about your breeding cycles and how they affect your aggression patterns. We know about the neural parasites you carry that make you susceptible to certain frequency ranges. We know about the cultural taboos that you've hidden from other species for generations. The third hegemony ship had not only stopped but was beginning to move backward. But most importantly, she continued, and her voice now carried something that Ziktar would later recognize as pure, concentrated psychological dominance. We know that your entire military philosophy is based on the assumption that other species will respond to aggression with fear negotiation or similar aggression. You have no protocols for dealing with a species that responds to your threats with intimate knowledge of your deepest fears. She paused, and in that pause, Ziktar could almost feel the hegemony commander's confusion and growing dread. So here is what will happen. Ambassador Castillo said, her voice now carrying an absolute certainty that seemed to make reality itself bend around her words. You will withdraw from this sector immediately. You will not approach any vessel carrying human diplomatic immunity. And you will transmit a message to your high command explaining that you have encountered a species that wages war in dimensions you cannot even comprehend. The silence that followed seemed to last forever. Finally, the lead hegemony commander appeared on screen again. His predatory features now showed something that Ziktar recognized despite their alien nature, uncertainty, and fear. This is not overhumans, the commander said, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. Yes, it is. Ambassador Castillo replied simply, withdraw. The three hegemony vessels powered down their weapons, turned and accelerated away from the system with what could only be described as haste. As the enemy ships disappeared from sensors, the bridge of the boundless horizon was silent. Every officer representing multiple species with vastly different psychological makeups stared at the screen where Ambassador Castillo's image remained. Ambassador, Ziktar finally managed to say, "What? How did you do that?" Her expression shifted again, returning to something approaching the warm diplomatic persona he had first met. But now he could see the layers beneath it, the strategic mind, the psychological warfare expert, the being who could shift between emotional states like weapons in an arsenal. Captain Edith. She said human emotions aren't just biological responses. They're tools, communication devices, weapons when necessary. What your command was right to worry about isn't that we can feel, it's that we can make others feel. Over the following hours, as the threat passed and the boundless horizon resumed its diplomatic mission, Ziktar found himself in conversation with Ambassador Castillo in his private ready room. She had changed back into her diplomatic attire, but he would never again see her the same way. You manipulated not just their emotions, he said, trying to understand what he had witnessed, but their perceptions, their very sense of reality. In a way, yes, she agreed. Humans have had to develop these abilities because we're not the strongest species, we're not the fastest. We don't have the most advanced technology. But we learn to survive by understanding psychology, by reading emotional states, by influencing how others think and feel. But how is this possible? How can emotional expression affect other species so profoundly? Ambassador Castillo smiled. Captain, emotions aren't unique to humans. Every species experiences some form of them fear, curiosity, aggression, social bonding. Humans have just learned to recognize these patterns across species barriers and to influence them deliberately. She gestured to the large viewing port that showed the stars beyond. Your alliance operates on the principle that logic and cooperation will triumph over aggression and chaos. The hegemony believes that strength and domination are the universal truths, but humans have learned that the real universal truth is emotion, the feelings that drive all decisions, all cultures, all conflicts. Siktar was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. So, when your Alliance command was concerned about emotional weaponization, they were right to be concerned, she admitted. But they were thinking in terms of direct manipulation, like using technology to alter brain chemistry or controlling individuals. What humans offer is something much more complex and, frankly, much more powerful, which is understanding, empathy, the ability to feel what others feel, to predict their emotional responses, to influence entire civilizations through psychological insight rather than force. She leaned forward in her chair. Captain, the tears you saw me shed on the first day, those were real. My father had died and I was genuinely grieving, but I also knew that displaying that grief would help your crew understand that emotions aren't weakness, they're authentic expressions of experience. An authentic experience creates trust. Siktar felt that unfamiliar sensation again, stronger now. Was it admiration? Fear? Some combination of both. So you used your genuine grief as a diplomatic tool. I allowed my authentic self to be seen, knowing that authenticity would achieve diplomatic goals. There's a difference between manipulation and honest expression of complex inner states. She stood and moved to the viewing port. Captain, your Alliance has achieved remarkable things through logic and cooperation. The hegemony expands through force and intimidation. But humans might offer a third path expansion through understanding, influence, through empathy, peace, through psychological cooperation, rather than mere political agreement. In the days that followed, Siktar watched as the implications of human emotional capabilities rippled through his ship. His crew began asking Ambassador Castillo and her people to teach them about emotional expression, about reading psychological states, about the subtle art of empathetic communication. Lieutenant Keth, during one informal gathering, asked Ambassador Castillo to explain the concept of hope, an emotion his species supposedly didn't experience. When she described it as the belief in possibility despite evidence to the contrary, and then demonstrated the facial expressions and vocal tones associated with hope, Keth spent hours practicing them. Pax, whose crystalline nature made him naturally logical, became fascinated with the human concept of intuition, making decisions based on emotional rather than purely logical criteria. How do you know when an emotional response is correct? He asked. You don't, Sarah Williams had answered. That's part of what makes emotions powerful. They require courage, the willingness to act on feeling, even when you can't prove the feeling is right. But it was communications specialist Vora who had perhaps the most profound realization. During one of the evening discussions, she turned to Ambassador Castillo and asked, when you changed your emotional expression to face the hegemony, when you became that psychological force, they couldn't resist how much of that was strategy and how much was genuine feeling. Ambassador Castillo had been quiet for a long moment before answering. The line between strategic emotion and genuine emotion isn't always clear even to humans. When I faced those ships, I was genuinely angry about the threat to this vessel and its crew. I was genuinely protective of the diplomatic mission. I was genuinely contemptuous of their bullying tactics. The strategy wasn't in creating fake emotions, it was in choosing which genuine emotions to amplify and express. On the final day of the human delegation's visit, as they prepared to return to their vessel, Siktar found himself walking with Ambassador Castillo to the docking bay. The corridors, which had seemed so familiar at the beginning of her visit, now felt different. His crew moved differently, spoke differently. He could see in their faces across multiple species expressions and emotional nuances that had never been there before. Ambassador, he said, as they reached the airlock, I need to ask you directly, are your people prepared to share these capabilities with the Alliance? Or are we witnessing a demonstration of powers that you'll keep to yourselves? She turned to face him, and in her eyes, he saw something that he now recognized as sadness mixed with hope. Captain Humans don't consider emotions to be weapons to be hoarded or technologies to be controlled. They're part of communication, part of understanding, part of building relationships across species barriers. She gestured back toward the ship they were leaving. Look at your crew. In just a few days, they've begun to develop emotional awareness that will make them better diplomats, better explorers, better beings. We didn't give them some secret human technology. We just helped them recognize capacities they already had. But the power you demonstrated against the hegemon, that came from understanding, not from some special human ability to control minds. Any species could learn to read psychological states, to influence emotional responses, to use empathy as a diplomatic tool. Humans have simply been practicing these skills for thousands of years because we had to, because we were small and weak and had to survival through social cooperation rather than individual strength. As the human delegation prepared to board their vessel, Pax approached Ziktar with something that might have been termed an urgent expression. Captain Wu. He said, his crystal features reflecting complex patterns of light. I've been analyzing the psychological impact of the human presence on our crew. I believe we've witnessed something unprecedented in Alliance history. What do you mean? The humans haven't just demonstrated emotional capabilities, sir. They've triggered an evolutionary leap in our own emotional development. Every species on the ship has begun to access emotional ranges they didn't know they possessed. The implications for Alliance psychology diplomacy, even military strategy, are staggering. Ziktar looked around at his crew at Vora, whose insectoid features now carried subtle expressions of contentment. At Lieutenant Keth, whose serpentine form moved with a fluidity that suggested emotional states rather than just physical positioning. At his engineering officers, who had been observed singing human music while working. Ambassador Castillo had been listening to this conversation, and she stepped closer to them. Captain Ziktar, First Officer Pax. She said, what you're observing is what happens when emotional barriers between species begin to break down. Humans learned long ago that emotional expression is a form of communication that transcends language, culture, even biology. She paused, looking at each of them in turn. Your alliance has achieved incredible things through logical cooperation between species. But imagine what you could achieve if that cooperation was enhanced by emotional understanding, by empathy, by the kind of intuitive communication that allows beings to understand each other's feelings across species barriers. Ziktar felt something he was beginning to recognize as a complex emotional state. Excitement mixed with apprehension, curiosity mixed with respect, and something he thought might be what humans called hope. Ambassador, he said, when you return to human space, what will you tell your government about us? I'll tell them that the Galactic Alliance is ready for the next stage of interspecies evolution. She replied, I'll tell them that we've found partners who aren't afraid to learn, who aren't threatened by emotional growth, who understand that true strength comes from understanding rather than domination. She moved toward the airlock, then turned back. And Captain, I'll tell them that we witnessed something remarkable. The moment when multiple species began to realize that emotions aren't a human peculiarity to be studied or feared, but a universal capacity to be developed and shared. As the human vessel undocked and moved away into the starfield, Ziktar stood on his bridge watching their departure. Around him, his crew continued their duties, but he could see the changes in them, subtle but profound shifts in how they moved, how they communicated, how they related to each other. Captain Pax said, approaching him with what Ziktar now recognized as an expression of thoughtful concern. I've been drafting our report to Alliance Command. How should I describe the implications of human emotional capabilities? Ziktar considered the question carefully. Alliance Command had been worried about emotional weaponization, about the threat humans might pose to the logical order of Alliance civilization. But what they had witnessed wasn't a threat to their way of life. It was an enhancement of it. Tell them, Ziktar said slowly, that we have encountered a species that has mastered what might be the most powerful force in the universe, the ability to understand and connect with other beings on a level deeper than language logic or even survival instinct. He gestured toward the viewport where the human ship was disappearing among the stars. Tell them that humans have shown us that emotions aren't the opposite of logic. They're logic's most powerful ally. And tell them that the Alliance has been invited to join not just a political or economic partnership, but an emotional evolution that could change how all species interact throughout the galaxy. Pax nodded, his crystalline form reflecting what Ziktar was learning to interpret as understanding and agreement. And the hegemony incident, Captain. How do we report the way Ambassador Castillo handled that situation? Ziktar smiled, an expression he had learned from humans and found surprisingly natural. We report that humans demonstrated a form of defense that requires no weapons, no shields, no violence, only a deep understanding of psychology and the courage to use emotional truth as both shield and sword. In the weeks that followed, the Boundless Horizon made its way back toward Alliance space, but the ship that arrived was not the same one that had departed. The crew had been transformed not by technology or political alliance, but by exposure to a different understanding of consciousness itself. Lieutenant Keth began developing new communication protocols based on emotional recognition across species barriers. Vora started a ship-wide program teaching crew members to recognize and express emotional states safely and effectively. The engineering department reported increased efficiency and cooperation as emotions became integrated into their work processes. But it was Pax who made perhaps the most significant observation, reporting to Ziktar several weeks into their return journey. Captain, analysis of our diplomatic protocols suggests that incorporating emotional awareness and empathetic communication techniques could revolutionize how the Alliance conducts interspecies relations. How so? Consider our encounter with the hegemony, Pax explained. Traditional Alliance response would have been diplomatic communication followed by retreat or military defense. The human approach, psychological understanding, and emotional influence achieved a nonviolent resolution that not only protected us, but actually reduced the likelihood of future hegemony aggression in this sector. Ziktar nodded, remembering the look of genuine uncertainty and fear in the hegemony commander's eyes. They weren't just driven off, they were made to understand something about themselves that they hadn't realized before. Exactly. Ambassador Castillo didn't threaten them with human military power. She threatened them with human psychological insight. She made them confront their own emotional vulnerabilities. In his private quarters that evening, Ziktar composed his final report to Alliance Command. As he wrote, he found himself choosing words that he hoped would convey not just the facts of their mission, but the emotional significance of what they had learned. To Alliance Command, Diplomatic Corps Xenological Department, from Captain Ziktar, Starship Boundless Horizon. First Extended Contact Mission, Human Species. Summary. The human species represents an unprecedented opportunity for Alliance evolution. Their emotional capabilities are not a threat to be contained, but a resource to be embraced. Recommend immediate implementation of interspecies emotional education programs and formal agreement to human proposals for enhanced diplomatic cooperation. Detailed analysis. Human emotional expression and psychological insight operate as a form of meta-communication that transcends traditional language and cultural barriers. This capacity enabled them to 1. Achieve diplomatic breakthroughs through empathetic understanding. 2. Resolve military conflicts without violence through psychological influence. 3. Accelerate emotional development in Alliance crew members. 4. Demonstrate forms of interspecies cooperation previously thought impossible. Conclusion. The humans' offer of emotional partnership represents an evolutionary opportunity for the Alliance. Their abilities suggest that the next stage of galactic civilization will be characterized not just by technological advancement, but by emotional and psychological sophistication. Personal note, Commander. We left Alliance space believing we were conducting a routine first contact mission. We return with the understanding that we have encountered a species that could help transform what it means to be sentient in this universe. The implications extend far beyond trade agreements or military alliances. They touch on the very nature of consciousness, communication, and civilization itself. I respectfully submit that the answer to the question of whether humans weaponize emotions is this: they have weaponized understanding itself. And in doing so, they have shown us weapons we didn't know we needed. Empathy, intuition, emotional intelligence, and the courage to feel as well as think. The human tears that initially alarmed us were indeed a sign that an end had begun, the end of purely logical interspecies relations, and the beginning of something far more complex, far more powerful, and far more hopeful than anything the Alliance has previously imagined possible. Recommendation: Full Diplomatic Alliance, with immediate implementation of joint emotional education programs across all Alliance species. End report. As the Boundless Horizon approached Alliance space, bringing news of humanity's emotional capabilities to a galaxy unprepared for such concepts, Ziktar found himself standing again at the viewport contemplating the stars. But now when he looked at them, he didn't see just points of light or possible civilizations to contact. He saw possibilities for connection, for understanding, for forms of communication that went deeper than language or logic. Behind him, he could hear his crew species that had regarded each other with professional respect for years now, sharing what humans had taught them to recognize as friendship, curiosity, hope, and a dozen other emotional states that had enriched their daily interactions immeasurably. The human ambassador had been right. They had witnessed an end and a beginning. The end of the Alliance as a collection of logical civilizations bound by practical agreements, and the beginning of something unprecedented. A galactic community connected not just by treaties and trade routes, but by emotional understanding and empathetic cooperation. As the first Alliance space station appeared on their sensors, Ziktar realized that they were not just returning home. They were bringing home a gift that would change every other species in the galaxy. The gift of emotional awareness, of psychological sophistication, of understanding that the deepest truths of existence were not found in logic alone, but in the complex interplay of thought and feeling that humans had mastered. The tear that Ambassador Castillo had shed over her father's death had indeed marked the beginning of an end. The end of emotional isolation between species, the end of purely rational intergalactic diplomacy, the end of the assumption that feelings were weakness rather than strength. And perhaps most importantly, it marked the beginning of an understanding that in a universe full of different forms of consciousness, the most powerful tool for communication, cooperation, and even conflict resolution was not superior technology or logical argument, but the simple, profound capacity to understand what others feel and to share what they themselves feel in return. As the Boundless Horizon prepared to dock, Ziktar touched the communication panel one more time, opening a channel to the human ship that had long since departed for Earth. Ambassador Castillo, he transmitted across the vast distances of space, knowing the message would take weeks to reach her. Thank you for teaching us that logic and emotion are not opposites, but partners, that strength and feeling can coexist, that the future of galactic civilization lies not in what species can build or conquer, but in how well they can understand each other and themselves. The transmission sent Ziktar prepared to face an alliance that would soon discover, as his crew had, that the humans' greatest gift was not their technology or their strategic capabilities, but their invitation to every other species to become more emotionally aware, more empathetically connected, and more fully conscious than they had ever thought possible. The tears had been just the beginning. The real transformation was yet to come.